Hi, I'm Melia Russell, and I thought I'd start by sharing a tweet I saw with you all. Yesterday, a tech worker posted, "I don't want to work for a company that values my output, but doesn't value my input."
That's good.
That was like, Across the tech landscape, employees are speaking out and blowing the whistle at tech companies, including Microsoft, Oracle, Google, Tesla. And over the next hour, we're going to talk about, or 40 minutes, we're going to talk about why that's happening, how businesses are responding, and how we can create some more positive feedback loops for employees. First, I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel. Nancy Vitale leads a global team of HR professionals as Senior Vice President of Human Resources at Genentech. Heather Whiteman, a PhD in Human Capital, runs People Strategy and Analytics at GE Digital. Rajeev Singh, CEO of Accolade, a service that lets employers help their workers navigate their healthcare options. And Jack Altman, co-founder and CEO of Lattice, which builds performance management software for growing companies including Reddit, Cruise, Coinbase, and Asana. Should we give it up for them? I think so. All right, so first we're going to assess the problem. Panelists, why is it important for employees to feel heard today?
I'll start. I think there's been a lot of research done that shows there's an absolute correlation between employee experience and the results of what the organization and the company is doing. And I recently saw some research done by Altman in their Altman Barometer Trust Index that showed that employers are actually the most trusted institution in the US today. And I think when you consider the mechanisms that engender trust, listening, acknowledging, responding are some of the mechanisms that really support building that trust.
Maybe to add on to that is the idea today that culture is more and more the defining attribute of a business, and that a culture oftentimes is definitionally how we behave, the values we hold, the things we care about. And if you were to go ask a lot of the founders of Silicon Valley companies right now, the evolution of their business has perhaps gone beyond where they thought it would be, and the decisions being made by employees every single day, theoretically being driven by those culture, those values, are guiding their business. More so than the strategy in some respects. And so those employees feeling heard and being understood is a really huge part of defining and driving culture.
Yeah, I think, Jack, we talked on the phone earlier about how just the sheer amount of time people are spending at work today means that they better like going to work for that company.
Yeah, and I think, if there's cultures, we've all probably been part of cultures where employees do feel heard, and so when they do, they want to contribute. And when employees are screaming into the void, they just stop. And I think today, your company does better if people are contributing to strategy and decisions at all levels. And so it's also just like a strategic part where when your employees want to contribute, you do better. And so I think it's important for business reasons too.
Yeah, I like this phrase, screaming into the void. One thing we've seen in the last few years is the power of social media, that people are kind of, when they don't feel heard, taking the conversation online. Are you seeing your companies respond to that as a tool for employee feedback?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about social media and the impact, it's been kind of interesting. So I thought this was a good topic. I wanted to join mostly because I'm from a company that has historically been very, very positive, and lately not so positive. So it's one of those times when I think it's easy to drive a culture when your company is doing well. It's so easy to drive culture, to listen to employees, for everyone to feel heard when the stocks are climbing and everything's just looking great. It's a completely different conversation when you find yourself where the stock's dropping and so much is happening and so many shifts. And then you throw on top of that this present that's employees are out there on social media sharing how they feel about your organization and the company that you may never hear if you just look internal. So we do have internal kind of social media presence, but it doesn't tell us the same thing as external. Like, I think we were talking about like things like Glassdoor and tools like that. I'll say there's even some out there that are, in my opinion, like the dark world. Things like Blind and other ones, which quite frankly is a little negative for me. But that's the area where we need to look into social media and things like that so that we can understand better how our employees are feeling. And you're not going to know that if you're looking inside of your company.
Do you guys know what Blind is? Nods. Really quickly, Blind is an app. Were you about to whip it out? No. Oh, okay. I'm your friend. Blind is an app that almost like instant messenger, but people go into chat rooms and can talk anonymously about their companies. And Blind verifies you are an actual Salesforce employee because they verify your work email address. That's what they use to create the login. So it's, it's become a dark place on the internet. That's great. Well, I think we can transition to talk a little bit about what are some things you guys are seeing companies, either your own or others, that are doing this right. How are they creating an outlet for employees to speak up?
I'll jump in. I'll tell you a little bit about our business just so you have context behind it. About half of our employees are people who work in what you would traditionally call a call center. They're what we call health coaches, nurses, pharmacists, a few doctors. And then the other half of the business, engineers, building software, salespeople, marketers, what you would traditionally call it. One side is traditionally called a call center, the other side would traditionally be called knowledge workers, even though they're all knowledge workers. And one of the things that we wrestled with was the hard desire to make sure that we had a single culture, a single set of beliefs and values across both of those work streams. And the mission-based orientation of what we did was an awesome driver of that, meaning we were lucky enough that what we do is we help people navigate through the healthcare system. People come to work for us because they want to help people do that. So that's awesome. But that said, some of the challenges we felt were the different sort of frame of reference that every single set or every single team came to the table with as it related to the problems they were trying to solve. A nurse who's been working in a hospital for the last 25 years has a totally different frame of reference than a software engineer working on artificial intelligence. And one of the things that we found, and this is just an example, and I'll kick it to the rest of my panelists, that was really important in our listening paths. We do the traditional things like employee surveys on a monthly basis. We do an engagement score. We check Glassdoor. We do all of the stuff that probably a lot of you are doing. But we opened up some of our listening paths to be, what do we need from each other? As opposed to what do we need from management, or what do we want the business to change, or what benefit would we like? It was driving an understanding of what every team was responsible for, and driving a vehicle or an avenue for teams to express their needs, oftentimes which were emotional. I need to feel heard better by the engineering team, or by the marketing team, or by the sales team. That has been a profound change in the way our teams interact, which we would not have thought of prior to opening up some of these listing paths.
And how do you ensure accountability, that you're responding to what you're hearing?
That's a great one. There's two parts to accountability, actually, and I think somewhere later in these dialogues we'll talk about anonymous feedback versus named feedback, because I think anonymous feedback has a place. There's also times where it doesn't have a place. But our rule is every piece of feedback that comes through, and we'll categorize it and then lay it out in our monthly employee meetings and say, here's what we heard in categories. We'll respond. We'll respond within the quarter, like, here's what we're going to do, or we're not doing anything about that because we disagree, which sometimes is a little sticky, but it's good. It's a good kind of sticky.
Melia, I'll kind of chime in here a little bit. And This mic's going in and out, I apologize. Back to the question you asked prior to in terms of social media and what Heather was saying, I think you have to look external and internal in terms of the mechanisms that you provide. And for us on the social media platforms, we're also trying to co-create with our employees from a content perspective. And so we leverage a technology called Dynamic Signal that helps us kind of co-create that content where it makes it readily available for folks to then engage. And that's helped us, as a life sciences company serving patients, to tell those stories or to recruit more diverse talent. So that's one example. Another one, going back to Rajeev's, comments in these different forums and mechanisms, we've done something called our Genentech Executive Committee Coffee Chats. And so we've tried to create, with a group of 20 or so employees, we have 14,000 employees across the US, but in groups of 20 or so, create a living room style format that's casual and informal, that gives people access to senior leaders, no agenda, just Q&A and dialogue. And while we're able to address questions and concerns, as senior leaders, we're also able to get back a lot of feedback and input and ideas. So that's just a couple examples of how might you leverage an array of mechanisms to really both listen but also share in the storytelling.
I'd also add, I think, on maybe it was your most recent question about what are the things that companies can do sort of generalized across the board that will lead to healthy cultures. And I was thinking about this because obviously we're all sort of our unique sort of blend of whatever our culture is comprised of and what our businesses are. But I think two of the things that we've seen that are sort of uniform across all strong cultures that we can at least do from a leadership level or a people level are transparency and vulnerability. And I think what those two things do are when you're and obviously these both come at some cost, and we can't be perfect on both of these. But I think to the degree that we can be transparent, it leads to employees understanding why we're making business decisions. And even if something's imperfect, here's how we got there, and here's why. And then I think vulnerability sort of gives employees sort of slack for the company. And it sort of leads to forgiveness, that we're not perfect, we don't know everything, we're trying to prioritize the best we can, and we actually want your input. I think those two things are sort of uniform, what we see at least sort of across kind of a lot of the cultures that we look up to a lot.
Are you doing those, the transparency kind of reports in person, in email?
So I think this is like a sort of system of communications that you have to design across your company where you're going to have many formats and you need to have many formats, but common examples might be mixing all hands with team manager meetings with like exec team meeting notes that are shared out with like one-on-ones that are meant for the employee. And maybe you build some architecture like that, but that in total comprises like, a transparent system.
Yeah, I was just going to give an example because I agree with that. And actually about 6 months ago, our organization started doing, it's kind of like the coffee notion, but for everyone. Every other week, there's a 30-minute call that has absolutely no agenda. We use a tool called Slido where employees can enter in their questions and you upvote things that you want answered. And the entire leadership team sits there for a half an hour and answers every single question in order. From the employees, if we run out of the half hour and there's anything that's ranked high, they get addressed in a blog that goes out. And this is something we started doing about 6 months ago to deal with the fact that, we didn't have a lot to share, and employees assumed that that's because we were hiding things. And we're like, no, we actually don't know. But it gave us the opportunity to say, just ask. We'll tell you whatever we can, whatever you care about. And, as I mentioned before, when hard times, there's something to that, to let them know, like, hey, every other week we're here. You ask, just ask, we'll answer. And it's to that notion. I wanted to give a real example of how we've implemented that recently.
I think the point about vulnerability is a really important one as it relates to if the only time you're getting up in front of your company is talking about good news, we just signed a big deal, let's talk about it, you will over time begin to lose the credibility of that team, meaning standing up in front of that team on a regular intervals every couple of weeks is awesome. And talking about the good news and the bad, and specifically where the executive team has an opportunity, in my view, to take accountability for, that we placed this bet, it didn't work. And there's going to be moments where we place bets that don't work, and that's on us, but, here's what we're going to do next. Vulnerability is sort of hand in hand with this capacity, in my view, to be able to communicate hard news and to do so with some acceptance of responsibility.
Yeah, I guess just this notion of transparency and vulnerability keeps coming up, and we've used a similar technology called Poll Everywhere. But I think what that does is it puts you as the leader in a very vulnerable position because you have no idea what people are going to ask. And as your people get to vote, you could have some really sensitive topics that make it up to the top, but you're being vulnerable, you're being transparent, and you're being very real. And I think that, engenders trust and this notion of how do you, engage your organization in a way that is healthy.
Let's talk a little bit about how your employees are engaging with each other when the bosses aren't in the room, maybe. Employee resource groups go by a lot of names: affinity groups, employee networks. If you work at Salesforce, they're called Ohana groups. And, no matter what they're called, the common purpose is getting employees together to engage. Have you guys found ERGs to create inclusivity at your companies? Is it something you recommend implementing, at an early stage company, even when you maybe can't fill a classroom yet?
Yeah, I would say for us, they've played a super important role, and we call them diversity network associations, or DNA groups, to play with our life sciences theme. And in terms of this role that they play, it all started out with, social connection and giving employees an opportunity to really connect with people that they share something in common with, primarily from a demographic perspective. But I think those play a really important role in terms of connection and community in the organization, but you can't stop there. And we are on this evolution right now to think more in terms of intersectionality, because no longer do we define ourselves by one demographic, but beyond that, allyship, and how can different DNA groups be allies for one another. And an example of that is our Genentech women's professional group runs something called G-Pods, and this was likened after Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In Circle or Bill George, his True North concepts. And it really is about inviting, groups of 8 to 12 employees together from multiple DNA groups, just as a support network over a 6-month period of time. They meet monthly, and it's really grassroots. The topics are driven by those folks really to support one another. It's not a company-sponsored or sanctioned event. It's more, this is something that our employee base felt was needed. But I think these ERGs or DNA groups really do provide that support from an allyship perspective. And then you can start moving into more of those business impact areas. How do you leverage or tap your organization with people that have passion around certain topics that you can benefit the organization from? But we're on that journey right now.
ERGs, anyone else?
Well, I mean, we have ERGs, we have plenty of them there. But just speaking for myself personally, what I've noticed is, the structured kind they do work really well. And in fact, I love them for the opportunities for leadership in an organization. It gets you the opportunity to, maybe you're not ready to step into leadership in your current role, but maybe you're ready to take on leadership within a group. I think there's some really amazing opportunities there. But I've found a little bit more fun, kind of tying it back to the social media lately, is there's been a lot that I've seen in our org of purely social meetups that have a disproportionate number of coworkers in them. So I've seen a couple meetups in the Bay Area where it's not a GE digital thing, but it just so happens that 8 out of the 11 people are from GE. So it's they're kind of forming on their own. Some of the more geeky ones call themselves guilds. Some are meetups. And those I've found more interesting because they've been more centered around passion as opposed to centered around a personal identity. And I think that those have a lot more promise because they bring together people who share a passion, something they can get behind, and it almost gives them that natural cross-diversity effect where we're all similar, we all care about one thing. So I'm actually more excited to maybe see the social world pick up on some of those places where ERGs can't.
I wanted to gauge, by show of hands, who works at a company with more than 150 employees? Oh, a lot of you, okay. You don't have to pay attention this part. No, I'm just kidding. I wanted to throw a question to Jack. Maybe first you could tell us a little bit about what Lattice does, and then also, what are some of the challenges of building feedback loops when you're a growing company or starting smaller?
Yeah, and so we're smaller. We're under 100. We work with customers who are up to thousands. So we both experience our own sort of product as a small customer, and then we work with larger customers. And basically what we offer is people management software. So it's performance reviews, feedback, goals, one-on-ones, updates, engagement surveys, pulse surveys, support with onboarding. Basically our view is that all of these systems should connect together, that employees' engagement and performance are very deeply connected, and that to the extent that it's possible, if we can give an integrated experience from the day that you join to your first one-on-one with your manager to understand the company's goals, to getting 360 feedback, to doing an engagement survey, that data ought to be sort of rich. So that's what we do. We work with about 1,200 customers, and it's a range. So there are companies that are like us, that are under 100 employees. There are companies that are 500, and there's some that are thousands. I think the main difference that we see for building feedback cultures is that the smaller you are, the more naturally it happens. And then the larger you are, the more you have to architect and instrument it. Something that my co-founder, who's our CTO, talks a lot about with engineering is what he calls the pit of success, which is that he wants to basically build our tech systems such that any engineer who gets thrown into it just can't help but succeed. And this is something that we talk about with cultures too, is how do you sort of build a pit of success in terms of a culture? So how do you make it the case that employees can't help but know what's going on at the company, that they can't help but receive feedback, that they can't help but have clear goals, all of those sorts of things. And I think the larger you get, the more you have to work on that. The less naturally it happens. So, for us at 63 people or whatever, we're all in one room. It's a big room, but we're all in one room. When we were 15 people, we all sort of knew everything that was going on. As you get larger, there's just no way for that to happen anymore, and so you have to build architecture for it. And so you see different things depending on the culture of the company. Is this a very transparent place? Is this a place that is all about positive feedback, or is this a culture that just prefers to sort of do their work and focus more on critical feedback? Is it goal-oriented and whatnot? But we do see some common patterns.
Yeah.
We do see people moving from annual performance reviews to twice a year. Some even do 4 times a year. Actually, we have a subset of customers who are doing trimesters, which I actually think is like a great period of time, but nobody really works on trimesters in the real world. But they're doing it more frequently. They're putting continuous feedback in the middle. They're trying to connect it with their employee engagement surveys. So we are seeing trends like that. But more or less, you just have to, the bigger you get, the more you have to architect.
Can anyone beat 4 times a year employee surveys? Not yet. Well, that actually brings up a great point. I think that we're starting to see companies do more frequent employee surveying. You mentioned another buzzword, 360 evaluations, which in honesty is something I had to Google search yesterday. Could someone tell me what a 360 evaluation is, and also how are you seeing employee surveying procedures start to evolve?
I'll start there. We will employ 360 reviews for certain leadership positions as we're attempting to build and grow a particular set of leaders into different roles, where we'll ask for feedback from not only their leadership or their management, but from their peers, from their colleagues, even from people who work on their teams. And leverage that feedback, in fact, in many ways to build coaching plans or to build growth plans for that individual, to say, look, here's the way you look when you're given a full view of all of the different angles that people are looking at you from, whether that's peer, colleague, subordinate, to the degree that term is still used. We'll do that type of work oftentimes really geared around trying to drive a full view of growth and coaching. The second part of the story for us, going back to, I think what Jack was talking about was more reviews on a quarterly basis. We're moving to that mode right now, where we really believe that the old mode of annual coaching plans, annual objectives, just doesn't keep pace with the pace of the business. And so for us, we look at annual reviews or we look at quarterly reviews, and we look at the number of times we're changing objectives during the year. And we used to kind of feel guilty about it. We'd actually do it, and then we'd get to the end of the year and we'd look at our objectives and we thought, man, we must not have enough discipline to stick with our goals. But what we really, maybe this is us just self-justifying, but what we really came to was business changes too fast to presume that all of your objectives can be exactly right at the beginning of the year. You have to give yourself permission to adjust and to change. And as you do so, you have to bring everybody with you. And that means adjusting objectives and changing the way you think about the way you're doing appraisals and reviews. And that has been, for us, as we've made that shift, and we're making that shift in stages, has been really liberating. It's been fantastic. People feel like they're heard, and that they're getting a really clear sense of where they stand.
Well, people measurement's sort of my bag. That's my thing. That's what I do. So I can't not jump in. In case anyone doesn't know, 360 is, getting an evaluation from 360 degrees around you, meaning people who work for you, peers who work with you, your boss's boss, is just trying to get an ecosystem of feedback. And as I've studied this a lot, actually, it's interesting. We've even found in some of the data where we've been able to do this is that employees' self-assessments of their technical or non-technical skills actually tend to be about half a level lower than what their managers would rate them as. I've got data to back that up. And actually, a more interesting fact that we found is the difference is even greater for competencies or skills in the business domain, like business acumen, understanding your company, understanding your customers. We found that it about doubles the difference. I think this is a really important fact because for employees who are trying to develop, they think they're somewhere. Their peers, managers, those people who could open up opportunities for them might think they're somewhere else. This is going to create a lot of disconnect as they try for that job, or they want to go work on that project, but they don't have, say, the business knowledge to do it successfully. And so having mechanisms for things like 360, I think, are really important to help someone get a better view of their own skills. And I'd flip it around too. Sometimes that manager has no clue how good that person really is, because they don't do it. Like, the person takes care of it. I don't know. I guess they're good. So it's a good opportunity to have it kind of flow both ways. I'm a big fan of 360. It's hard to pull off. It's hard to have it valid. It's hard to connect it. If anyone wants to get all psychometrics geeks with me later, I'll stick around for a while.
Yeah. All right, we've got about 2 minutes left before we're going to open it up to Q&A. So I'm going to jump ahead to our last question. In recent stories about problems at big companies, employees have complained that they expressed concern about safety or quality, but their voices were suppressed or overlooked. I know as a reporter that we are always jumping on whistleblower stories, and that they seem to, have a great impact on employee culture. Is whistleblowing something that companies should do more to encourage for the long-term benefit of the company?
I think so. And it's probably an HR leader's nightmare when that happens, externally.
Yeah.
But I think from, the premise of whistleblowing is how do you create an environment that people are going to speak up? And I think you need multiple mechanisms to do that. So quality and safety in our world are absolutely paramount when you're dealing with medicines that go into patients. And so how do you create multitude of opportunities that people can express their grievances or concerns? And so for us, we have dedicated departments within healthcare compliance or within our human resources group around employee relations. But we also have hotlines because we know, and this gets back to, I think, Rajeev, you were commenting on, anonymous feedback. You have to provide multiple avenues. Not everybody's going to be comfortable coming forward. So, where we have hotlines that enable people to just come forward and express a concern that we monitor frequently. But I think the key there is then what are people experiencing from what happens after I make that complaint. And, I've received anonymous letters from employees, and we take everyone seriously. And so how do you make that visible to people because you're not always going to broadcast an investigation or what you're doing. But over time, are they seeing and do they know that if they make a complaint or they express a concern, that the organization takes that seriously?
I would, to add to that, I'll put a different context on it for us. We sit on a treasure trove of healthcare data. Claims data, biometric data, pharmaceutical information. We know a lot about the individuals that we serve. And so security, data security is of paramount importance to us. And what we really try to inspire, what you really drive for, is self-reporting. If something bad happens, you got to tell us as soon as possible. And oftentimes, in an engineering environment or in other environments where social hacks can be a way that people break into your data, or you can have vulnerabilities that are exposed from an engineering perspective, the first reaction might be, I screwed something up and I don't want to tell anybody, which makes it way worse. And so for us, one of the things we really try to do when people self-identify, when people raise their hand and say, I think I screwed something up and it's getting worse, is to actually, this will sound crazy, but to celebrate the point. To celebrate the point that, hey, not only did we find it and fix it, but somebody raised their hand and said, I screwed it up. And that celebration of self-identification, particularly around security for us, is now a part of what we do. We actually send an email that says like, hey, we saw this, we found this, we fixed it. And that self-reporting actually is becoming ingrained, I hope, in the culture that we're building around things, hopefully, that lead to things like whistleblowers, et cetera.
So like turning some vulnerabilities into victories.
Totally.
Excellent. All right, with that, we're going to open it up for a Q&A, and we have mic runners, and there's a woman there.
Hi, just given, as a person who deals with conflict on a regular basis, I'm a conflict resolution specialist, and I'm just curious how you all deal with when you're talking about culture being a manifestation of both our values and our behaviors. Often when we hit conflict is when our behaviors don't match our values. So how do you work with that, and where do you draw the line between the professional and the personal when it comes to handling people's behaviors that don't match the company values or your values when conflict comes up?
I can start. I think one of sort of like the common failure modes at a company is I'm frustrated about what A is doing, so I'm going to tell my manager B. And I'm going to go to my manager B and I'm going to complain about this person, and my manager's going to maybe say, yeah, that's really difficult. It sounds like they're screwing up. And I think it's generally way healthier to say, have you talked to this person? Have you gone to them directly? And so I think there are things that you can do at a cultural level to institute. If ever somebody is coming to you with a problem about a third party, you should just institutionalize the ask, have you already talked to them about it? And I think there are a bunch of little simple kind of conflict resolution type of things like that that can be consistent with your cultural values that you encourage everybody to sort of act that help a lot. So I think there's probably a set of those, and I think they're probably different for different cultures, but whatever that set is that's kind of consistent with your beliefs, I think sort of teaching people at your company this is how we behave when conflict arises, I think is really powerful.
How about our HR bosses?
I won't answer to boss, but I'll answer to the question. You're an expert in this, and so I'm curious if you agree with this. But I think oftentimes we judge ourselves by our intentions, and we judge others by their behavior. And so when you're dealing with conflict, how do you bring out in the open the intentions of both parties more clearly, so that you're not guessing what's behind the behavior? And I think that's how do you set an environment or the culture that enables that dialogue to happen and probe that dialogue to happen?
What she said.
She doesn't agree. I'm curious what you
know,
at a break, we'll talk more.
Yeah, we can talk on the break, that's fine.
One of the...
Well, I will say this, that if you're looking for, especially when we're in such diverse workplaces, if you want to really bring up intention, but you also really want to focus on impact. And so if you're not holding impact in that conversation, then you're skipping over a big part of what tends to happen, especially when diversity is involved in the conflict.
Mm-hmm. I will say this too, because I heard a quote by a guy named Franz Johansson recently, and he said, diverse organizations, inclusion and perhaps low conflict is easy when you have no diversity. but rather when you have diversity, it makes inclusion really hard, and you should expect that there's going to be conflict.
I think you also have to provide some sort of a vernacular or a framework for resolving conflict. And it's oftentimes, it doesn't exist. And so I think Brene Brown uses the phrase rumble, and it's just a nice way to say, like, we're gonna hash this out. And other organizations, I'm particularly fond of the term crunchy. Like, we're gonna get crunchy right now. Like, it's gonna get crunchy, which means we're gonna have a chat. But the vernacular and the framework around how you're gonna have that chat is, I think, a really important framework to offer your team, to say, it's okay to say that, because it doesn't mean we don't like each other. It means we're trying to resolve a problem.
All right, other questions? Oh. Or not? All right, well, with that, thank you, panel, for being honest and admitting to the worst nightmares and how we can turn them into wins. Round of applause for our panel.